Well, all right, we are full tilt boogie on our Dodge Raider project. This is episode 10 of this 1988 Dodge Raider, voted the world's greatest 4x4 by all the leading publications. We left off with episode 9. I was working on the air boxes. Well, I continued this week with working on the air conditioning box, cleaned it out, put it back together, and then finished up with the heater core box. Replaced some of the foam around a couple of the trap doors, and then I took the heater core to the local radiator shop here in town to have them take a look at to see if they could repair it or rebuild it. Alright, we're gonna do the same process with this one by cleaning out all the gunk and re-greasing all the levers and pivot points, and then we'll replace the foam padding on these 3 doors. We got 3 doors in this one. Alright, you see there I put on a new foam around that edge. The old foam was just powdered, and now the door will shut and still hold a seal. Lubing up these cables for the actuators, putting a little bit of oil down each cable end. And they're not really that rough because it's a plastic sheath. It isn't like a metal sheath that can rust together, but it's definitely dry, so any type of oil you can get down there to help out a little bit. Alright, so the box is starting to come together. I've got the trap doors all rebuilt and working. So now I've just got to start attaching all of the clips to everything and the linkage. Okay, and lastly we're going to clean up this AC evaporator box. It's kind of dirty, and I don't think there's any foam parts to it, so that's good. And there's probably nothing broken in there, so I'm just going to take it apart and clean it and put it back together. Alright, so here's our rebuilt fan box. All sparkling, brand new. Got new foam. The trap door, which is controlled by this cable up here, has new foam in it. Got new foam around the edges. And I kept calling this a thermostat, but it's a resistor. It's a 3-stage resistor, and I put the ohms meter to it, and I couldn't quite figure out if it was working or not. So what I'm just going to do is put the battery on each resistor lead. You have a low, medium, and high as far as the fan speed. Just 12 volts goes through the resistor and cuts the voltage down depending on what your lever on the dash indicates. So before I order a new one, I thought maybe it might be bad because my ohms meter wasn't making sense, but I'll just try touching the leads to it and see if I get different fan speeds. So that's a low. Yep, it seems to work fine, so I don't have to order a new resistor pack. So that box is ready to be put back in the car. Or I could sell that on eBay, it'd probably make a couple $100. Probably could sell this for more than I paid for the whole car. Alright, I'm just wrapping up working on these air boxes. This is the heater core box. Sits on the left-hand side in the car, and this is the heater core, slides right into there, sits in that box, and those pipes go out the firewall. So I went down to the local radiator shop here in Burlington to have them rebuild this, because I'm finding online that these just aren't available. They don't make them anymore, and it's an odd size. So I couldn't find it. So I went to the radiator shop, and he explained the design. Mitsubishi made these, designed these to replicate like a mini radiator versus like a cell version of a heater core is a little more simplified than this is. And he said that he would blow this apart, order a new core, take the end caps off, solder it all back together, and charge me $350 plus tax. So I don't want to spend that much on a heater core. So the next plan is to just find a size similar to this. This is 6.5 by 7 by 2 inches. Actually 2.5 if you count the end caps. So I will get online and just find a heater core that has 2 spouts out this end of similar size, wrap the ends in foam, and slide it in there, and then I'll just pipe, do some custom piping here to get it out the firewall. So once I finished working on the air boxes this week, I switched back to the transmission pump. The bushing came in that I was waiting for, and that all went back together real smooth. Put the bushing in, put the torque converter seal back in the pump, and then it bolted right back on using some sealant. I'm going to replace the bushing, and I'm going to replace the front seal. We can put this back on the tranny next and have that out of our hair. right. I tapped out the old torque converter bushing and used it to tap in the new one. So that gets tapped down until it seats itself at the bottom. And now we have a new bearing for the torque converter to run on. Next I will clean all this up with brake cleaner, put it back together, and we will put this back on the car. Alright, I'm just lining up the bearing for this shaft that runs through the pump, and to make sure it's lined up correctly I'm going to attach some assembly lube to it so that it stays right there as I put it on. Alright, lastly we're going to torque these bolts down to 18 foot-pounds. When I took them off they were definitely tighter than that, so the last guy didn't worry about torquing values. Alright, there you go. So there's the finished product. We have the fluid pump back in the transmission. All the bolts are sealed, has a new O-ring around it, has a new bushing, and a new seal for the torque converter. So there's no leaks coming out of the front of this transmission, I guarantee that. Okay, so we're working on this transfer case tonight. My plan is to drain the transfer case oil out of this bolt here, and then you fill it by that bolt up there on top of the drum. But as soon as I drain this fluid, I'm going to replace a couple of seals. I've got the rear output shaft seal, you can see it's leaking right there. So I'll drop the driveline. I've already got the seal, and I'll tap it in. And then the front one also. The front one right here is getting pretty oily looking, so that seal will be replaced. However, when I was under here getting ready to take off this fluid bolt right here, I noticed that the transmission mount, let's see if I can show it to you, right there, that mount is bad. As I was goofing around with taking this bolt off, you can see that the transmission mount is completely toast. So I will be ordering a new transmission mount. Right there, I'll unbolt it and replace it. So you can see we're draining the transfer case fluid right now. It looks fairly dark. The magnetic bolt on the end had shavings from whatever mechanism is in there. So it's definitely time to replace this fluid. Okay, you can see here that we just unbolted this drive shaft from the front differential, and I'm going to pull it out of that transfer case so I can replace that seal. Alright, so I have this transmission mount off, and after looking at the book, it appears this might be stock to have this loose like this for the automatic transmission. The manual transmission has this as a solid rubber unit, whereas the automatic shows that it's in fact loose. I don't know why that would be. I'm going to look into it a little bit further. So I could have left this on the car, I suppose. So we'll clean this up. I'm going to get online and double check to make sure that's stock, because that seems silly, but maybe the automatic needed a loose transmission mount for some reason. So here is the Driveline disconnect that was added to this car. It's an aftermarket Remco, and this is a mechanism that attaches to a cable pulley in the cabin. When you want to disconnect, you pull the cable and it slides this collar back and forth, grabbing these teeth, so that the rear end spins independent of the driveline. You can see here it's disconnected. I can spin the rear wheels, but it doesn't spin the driveline into the transmission. What this is for is if you were towing this car behind an RV, you'd want to disconnect so you don't burn up your transmission. And normally what people do is just disconnect the driveline. 4 bolts, undo it. But it takes a while, especially if you want to get to your destination and drive this thing. So it's a pretty cool little feature. They spent about $2,500 to have this installed back in the day. But I'm not going to be towing it, so it doesn't necessarily help me at all. It kind of makes me nervous. There's one more link in the chain to perhaps have to service or that breaks. But I don't have the original driveline, so I don't have a driveline to put in here. So I'm just going to reuse this mechanism. I'm going to take it apart and re-grease it. This thing right here slides back and forth and pulls that collar down. But in order to drop the driveline to get the transmission out, I'm going to have to take it all apart. You can see here I'm taking apart the drive shaft from the rear differential, and I like to double up on wrenches just to get some leverage. You put one wrench on the nut, put a second wrench on the first wrench, and then you've got a pretty long bar here that you can put some pressure on, and as I push down it should crack loose. So I began working on the 4x4 shifter linkage after I got the pump in, and it just wasn't feeling right, so we just had to pull out the transmission. All right. Alright, there's the nasty cross member for the transmission. I'm going to take that outside and scrape it down and degrease it before we put it back together. Alright. We got the transmission dropped free of the truck. So next I have to raise the truck to get this out, and we will work on that tomorrow. And you can see here that I've lowered the transmission. It's completely free of the truck. It's just resting on the transmission jack. And I discovered an issue with the four-wheel drive shifter. it's not working properly. And when I took it apart a little bit to get the handle off, and found a missing bolt on top, and the shifter wasn't working properly. So I'm going to have to tear it apart and figure out what's going on. So here's the four-wheel drive shifter, and it was not feeling right, which is the main reason why I wanted to pull this out. And when you shifted this, the shifter inside the car, this is what was happening. It was pulling this casing all the way out and pushing it back in, and it's also missing a bolt here. So somebody's been into it, or something is broken. I'm gonna have to pull this whole transfer case apart and see what's going on as far as wear and tear, breakage, or what. But at the very least, this has to be dealt with right up here. Alright, let's break this apart and take a look at it. I'm curious to see what this looks like in here. Okay, so I did in fact discover the problem with the transfer case. It was stuck kind of in between gears because it's missing a screw right here. And this screw is a pin that holds in this casing that's sitting on the transmission, and that casing pops out. And the casing is attached to the shifter knob right there, up on top inside the cabin. So as you're shifting that, it's moving around this arm under here, back and forth and up and down. Well, it couldn't move the arm, it was just pushing this casing back and forth and wasn't adjusting the arm inside much. And it's because it was missing a bolt that holds that case together. Once that bolt is in there, then it moves that arm back and forth. So I've manipulated the tongs for four-wheel drive and two-wheel drive, and it works fine. It's on two-wheel drive right now. The front axle isn't turning, and as soon as I click it over, you can see the front one spins. And it turns smoothly, and I don't hear any noise, so I don't think I'm going to break this sucker apart. I think I'm just going to clean up the case, replace the seals and gaskets, and put it all back together. And then I got to figure out what kind of a pin I have to buy for that. It's going to be a bolt with a radius that clicks into that groove right there to keep this together. I also was able to spend a little bit of time on the steering column. I reused the bolts that I took out just by Dremel drilling or dremeling a groove into the top of the bolt for a flathead screwdriver, and used a little bit of Loctite. And then I also wrapped the steering wheel in a little bit of rubber tape, and that took up enough space to make the steering column shifter bracket tight, so it no longer rattles when you shift it or when you try to start the car. Alright, so I went down to the auto parts store to find a couple of new bolts for the steering column clamp that I'm working on. And I discovered that the head on this bolt is smaller than normal. If you buy a bolt that is this size, I forget the size, M8 by 125 or something like that, the bolt head, whether you're getting a Phillips screw or you're getting any type of a Allen key or something, is bigger and it won't fit in the recess on that steering wheel clamp. So I was going to have to grind the bolt small enough to fit in there. Well, I decided if I'm going to do some grinding, I might as well just reuse these bolts that I drilled out. I'm going to Dremel a flat spade slot in there for a screwdriver and just reuse these bolts. So that's what I'm doing now. So there you can see we just drilled a slot there so I can use a flathead screwdriver to screw these in, and I'll just use a little bit of Loctite. Okay, I'm working on this ignition lock situation that was loose, and I think I'm going to shim it with a little bit of rubber tape. I don't feel like grinding on it yet. I can. You can grind a little bit of surface off of where those two come together, and come up with you know, a smaller circumference there to grab that steering column. And I can't find any information on this design, so I don't think there's a reason why it needs to be loose like that. When these things are clamped together, you know, it's a little bit loose. This is the steering wheel lock. You know, when you click this key, it shoves a bolt out there which grabs the steering column. And the reason that those bolts are smooth on this side is that the manufacturer didn't want a car thief to be able to just unscrew it and disconnect the lock that easily. So I'm going to just shim this backside with some rubber tape and then tighten it down, and that should do the trick. A little bit of blue Loctite on each one of those bolts. Don't use the red, otherwise you have to break out a torch to get it undone again. And here's a close-up of this ignition lock clamp situation. You can see that these smooth bolts that I took out, I just Dremeled a slot for a screwdriver, and then I shimmed it with just this rubber tape. It's a thin rubber tape that isn't even sticky. It's just a thin rubber material, and I put a slice of it right in between the steering column and this side of the clamp. And so when it clamped down, it created a little bit of space in between the two halves, and now it is on there super tight. So when you turn your turn signals now, it isn't going to move the whole steering column. So like with many things on this Dodge Raider, parts are kind of hard to come by sometimes. They're not making the parts anymore, and it was kind of a rare car to start with. So the windshield was one of the things I was having trouble finding. I went to Lewis Auto Glass here in town. They've helped me with a few hot rod windshields over the years, the El Camino and a Chevelle and a couple other things. But they said they couldn't find one for the Montero. They said, out of luck, can't help you out. And I didn't see anything online other than there was a windshield on eBay for $350 or something with shipping. And I was like, man, that's a lot for a windshield. Well, I got a hold of All Valley Auto Glass here in town. Super nice guys, always eager to help. We used them on a couple of things recently. And I said, hey, can you guys get a Dodge Raider windshield? And he looked it up online and said, well, there's one in the state, Washington State. And I can have it in your hands tomorrow for $129. And I screamed, sold, I'll take it. So less than 24 hours later, I have it sitting here in my pickup. All right, we're fixing to take this windshield out of this car. And the way you do that is you peel the weather stripping away from the body, and you want to jam some sticks up into it and just keep working your way along here, especially around the top two corners and maybe halfway down the A-pillars before you can start pushing it out. There shouldn't be any adhesive sticking it to the body. There's a little bit of adhesive that's sticking the weather stripping to the actual window, but we'll deal with that once we have the window out. Alright, we got the the weather stripping for the front window. I'm going to try to reuse it. It looks like it's in pretty good shape. I'll clean it up and get rid of all the adhesive. The book calls for a bead of adhesive right in here between the window and the grommet. So we'll see how it goes. Yeah, this looks like it's in pretty good shape. I don't see any cracks or anything. So there you have it. That's an update for our Dodge Raider project. I'm going to spend the next week or so working on this transmission, getting it cleaned up, order a few gaskets and seals for it, and then we will prep to get that put back in the car hopefully next week. So check back and we will keep you updated. Bye.